All right, folks, we are back in Ezra this morning. We took another little break last week for Father's Day. So now we get to cover the portion where we left off on chapter 6. Today, we will cover about half of chapter 6, so from verse 1 to verse 12. And just as you are finding your place, to catch you up, to recapitulate, to remind you of what we have been discussing within this general context of Ezra in this particular chapter. So chapter 4 was all about the animosity that the Israelites faced, the Jews faced, when they came back to their homes to build their society, but specifically and most importantly, the temple. Chapter 4 was a thematic chapter. It didn't really follow a pure chronology, but again, the purpose was to document all of the challenges, all of the people that were against the Jews fulfilling this challenge of rebuilding their society. And then we move forward to chapter 5, where they had stopped building the temple, rebuilding the temple for about 15 years. And God utilized two prophets, specifically Jeremiah and Haggai, relatively well known, probably Jeremiah more so than Haggai, but they were there to stimulate, to instigate, to motivate people to continue to restart the rebuilding project. They had stopped again because of the challenges that they faced, because of the enemies that were in that region, and very likely for a while they just kind of gave in and gave up, thought that maybe it was not going to be something that they could accomplish because of the circumstances at hand. But again, God wanted them to move forward regardless of those challenges. So those two prophets were utilized by God in the beginning of chapter 5 to motivate them to continue to work. And so they did. And as they were continuing to work, they faced even more challenges. So a couple of individuals were introduced, these governors of sorts, and they went there to inspect. They overheard, they saw the commotion, they knew that something big was going on, so they basically interviewed, interrogated, and documented what was happening, and went to the current person in charge, Cyrus, to make sure, Darius, I should say, to make sure that what they were doing was lawful. Because a few years had gone by, almost 20 years had gone by, since the original decree of Cyrus, where he allowed these exiles to go back to their homeland, but not only go back, to rebuild the temple and their society, and he gave them furnishings, he gave them resources, he gave them, everything that they needed. But now leadership has changed. A few people now have come after Cyrus, and now we have this individual, Darius, who is in charge, but it seems like no one knows for sure exactly why or if this rebuilding project is legitimate. So these two governors, inspectors, one of them was the primary person in charge of this particular region. He gathered this information, and we left off in chapter 5 with a request. Basically, the request was to Darius that he would investigate in the records of the kingdom to see if in fact they had this ability, if it was lawful, if Cyrus in fact did give them permission to rebuild. So now we get the conclusion of that interaction. So let's go ahead and read again from chapter 6, verse 1 and we'll stop at verse 12. You can follow along as I read. Then King Darius issued a decree, and a search was made in the archives where the treasures were stored in Babylon. And at Achmetha, in the palace that is in the province of Media, a scroll, not a squirrel, a squirrel was found. They probably found some squirrels as well. And in it, a record was written thus. In the first year of King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where they offered sacrifices, and let the foundations of it be firmly laid, its height 60 cubits, and its width 60 cubits, with 3 rows of heavy stones and 1 row of new timber. Let the expenses be paid from the king's treasury. Also let the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple which is in Jerusalem, be brought to Babylon, be restored and taken back to the temple which is in Jerusalem, each to its place, and deposit them in the house of God. Verse 6. Now, therefore, Tattenai, governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar-Boznai, and your companions the Persians who are beyond the river, keep yourselves far from there. Let the work of this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build the house of God on its site. Moreover, I issue a decree as to what you shall do for the elders of these Jews. For the building of this house of God, let the cost be paid at the king's expense from taxes on the region beyond the river. This is to be given immediately to these men, so that they are not hindered. And whatever they need, young bulls, rams, lambs, for the burnt offerings of the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, and oil, according to the request of the priests who are in Jerusalem, let it be given them day by day without fail, that they may offer sacrifices of sweet aroma to God of heaven, to the God of heaven, and pray for the life of the king and his sons. Also, I decree that whoever alters this edict, let a timber be pulled from his house and erected, and let him be hanged on it, and let his house be made a refuse heap because of this. And may the God who causes his name to dwell there destroy any king or people who put their hand on to alter it, or to destroy this house of God which is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, issue a decree, let it be done diligently. So here we have the result of this investigation. At first, it seems something negative, It seems like what they had experienced already, which was, again, these enemies making troubles so that they couldn't continue the rebuilding project. The investigation went according to, their standards, which was legitimate. They just wanted to find out if, in fact, they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. So everyone who was in charge was involved in figuring this out. So that request was made to Darius, the current emperor at that time, to investigate, to look at the records that he had access to see if in fact they had this type of permission. And on verse 1 and 2, we see the result of that. And it says, then King Darius issued a decree, and a search was made in the archives where the treasures were stored in Babylon. So initially, they searched in Babylon, the city, the capital. This was the place where it was most likely for these records to be found. It was sort of the hub of the empire. However, after investigating, after searching for these records at that particular location, which again was the one who was most likely, it was the one that was referenced at the end of chapter 5 where they should be searching for these records, they actually could not find them there. So these scribes and these inspectors and investigators, they widened the search and they went to other locations, other places where such records could be found. And on verse 2, it's stated here, not in great detail, but it's stated, and at Achmetha, in the palace that is in the province of Media, a scroll was found, and in it a record was written thus. So they actually found it somewhere else. This was around 200 miles northeast of this capital city of Babylon. And they found it in this mountainous location where the emperors, the kings, these Persian kings, they would go during the summer months because the main capital was in a location where it was very hot, basically. So it served as the main capital, but it also served as the winter capital. And when summer came along, they actually moved. The king and his court went to another place, another location, and that served as the capital for the summer months. And they did all of the bureaucratic stuff that kings do and everything else that needed to be done, but in a different location. So this is where these documents were found. So the investigation was very thorough, and at the end, it was very successful after. It doesn't really say how much time it took. Very likely it took weeks for these records, for these documents to finally be found in a different location. But here we just see the fact that, again, they were very diligent. They were looking all over the place. They were searching to see if, in fact, the Jews could rebuild the temple, and if it was based on this legitimate decree that was written, that was made about 18 years prior. And now, on verse 3 to verse 5, it's a repetition of something that has already been mentioned several times. Initially on chapter 1 of Ezra, we have this documented, and in a couple other places this is repeated. This is basically the original decree that Cyrus made so that the Jews could go back to their homeland and rebuild. So basically there, from verse 3 to verse 5, you have, this authorization to rebuild the temple. You also have the dimensions, and here it says 60 cubits by 60 cubits, which is actually rather large. The temple itself was smaller than this, and very likely this measurement just was based on this idea of its potential size, or it could be up till this size. If you translate it to current day, more well-known measurements, it's about the length of a professional basketball court. Not only, the length and the width, but the height, because it would be, just basically a huge cube. And the temple itself was smaller than that. But again, we have all of this information. We also have the information pertaining to the construction materials, the stones, the timber, also where the funding would go to, come from, I should say. Basically, it would come from the treasury, the royal treasury. And these articles that were taken by Nebuchadnezzar, they were to be returned so that they could be placed once again in the temple after it was rebuilt. And then from verse 6 to verse 10, now we have a new decree. So originally, or initially here from 3 to 5, it was just a repetition of the previous decree. Basically, they were just reading this document that proved that the rebuilding project was legitimate. And now on top of this, now Darius is making another decree. And the decree basically stated here on verse 6 and verse 7 that there shouldn't be any interference from these local governments, these inspectors, these people who were to manage these smaller regions and, provide this information to the king. So it says here, and I'll read it once again, now, therefore, Tattenai, the governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar-Boznai, and your companions, the Persians, who are beyond the river, keep yourselves far from there. Let the work of this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God on its site. So essentially the king, the emperor said, let them be. Stop harassing them, stop investigating, stop questioning, stop interrogating, just let them be. It is legitimate. It is based on a decree. And I've mentioned this before, and it comes up every once in a while in the Bible pertaining to these decrees that the Medes and the Persians made. And they were not allowed to be revoked. So when something was made into law, it had to be obeyed. And Darius was saying, this was in fact lawful. Here we have the proof. And now allow them to continue to rebuild. And then, again, in this next decree, it was just he was just reinforcing the original decree and going a little bit beyond. So on verse 8, we see where the funding was going to come from. Moreover, I issue a decree as to what you shall do for the elders of these Jews for the building of this house of God. Let the cost be paid at the king's expense. Okay, the king is pretty generous, wouldn't you agree? But then there's an adage there, or an added information, from taxes. At the king's expense, from taxes. So who was really paying for this? The people were paying for this. Even some of the enemies of the Jews were paying for this. That's what taxes are. Even though the king has these resources, they originate from the people. So there is a level of irony here. The very people who were the enemies of the Jews were now funding this building project. I remember fun times, right? Trump presidency, regardless of where you are at in the spectrum of politics, you have to agree, it's fun, right? And I remember when he, came back into office after the 4-year hiatus, they were investigating the expenditures of the previous regime, right? And there was this entity called Doge, right? Or Doge, something like that. Doge. Department of something. That's it. And they were to go through records to see, what these entities, how they were spending the government's money. And, their findings were rather comical. Certain things that were being invested on were rather ridiculous. One of my favorite ones was this bullet point that cost about 10 to 20 million. And basically, this nonprofit was funding the Iraqi government to build their own version of Sesame Street. Literally, 10 to 20 million dollars for Iraqi Sesame Street. Now, I don't even think the American version is worth that much. It's just, you got the big bird, you got the green trash-looking puppet, you got a couple other, and it's fun for kids. But really, $20 million? And, their counter argument was, well, this is being paid for by a nonprofit. Well, who funds the nonprofit? Well, the government is the one that actually allocates these. Well, how is the government funded? Well, it's the taxpayers. Ultimately, taxpayers were paying $10 to $20 million for Iraqi Sesame Street. Irony, right? How ironic. So here, I'm sure some people were upset. Much like you should have been upset. They were upset, but it didn't matter. Darius made sure that even the enemies of the people of God were going to pay for this endeavor. And then it continues on verse 9. It states, and it lists there certain provisions of the sacrifices, the resources that they would need. And then on verse 10, there's an interesting note here, because Darius sort of adds somewhat of a demand/request. And it says here on verse 10, that they may offer sacrifices of sweet aroma to the God of heaven, and pray for the life of the king and his sons. Pray for the life of what king? Him and his sons. So again, adding that note there, at the very least, he understood that that was a possibility, right? That was something that could serve as an advantage. We don't have enough insight from the Bible to know or even conclude that Darius was saved, believed in God, but at the very least he understood that there was a possibility that this was a legitimate God that could even serve him in certain ways if he was friendly to his people. And then the concluding portion of this section, verse 11 and verse 12, is essentially a curse, which was very much part of this ancient Eastern language of sorts. Whenever they did a decree or a document of this sort, they established the ground rules, and then towards the end, in the concluding remarks, they established, sort of the penalties if someone were to go against these norms, right? And it says here on verse 11, also I issue a decree. So it's decree upon decree upon decree, right? That whoever alters this edict, let a timber be pulled from his house. So basically a big, log be pulled from the house, and let him be hanged on it. This terminology here, it actually, makes it, no one likes to be hanged, right? So it is negative in nature, but it's actually, it softens a little bit, because the term is actually to be impaled, which, you're going to die one way or another, but if you have a choice between hanging and impaling, I pick hanging, right? I don't know about you. Nevertheless, there was punishment, right? And then, after this, it stated that, the house would be turned into, rubble, essentially. And then he signs off on the decree by saying, I, Darius, issue a decree, let it be done diligently. So here we have the conclusion of this investigation. And again, it is a rather favorable one. Something that very likely and initially caused a lot of anxiety, a lot of, trauma, basically. The Jews were very likely were like, man, here we go again. We took a 10 to 15 year break, and now as we are starting over again, we get bombarded by these enemies that want to stop our progress, right? But actually, it turned out very favorable. If not for this investigation, this project would have stayed in limbo, because again, the leadership had changed. And now people really didn't know why they were there doing what they were doing. But because of this investigation, now it was made very clear that it was legitimate, and it was made even more concrete how they should be doing what they were doing. And everyone needed to respect that. Everyone needed to abide by this previous decree and this new decree that just kind of reinforced what was previously established by Cyrus. Now let's backtrack a little bit to a pertinent information that we saw in the beginning of this section. And I mentioned to you, originally, the request was, and the idea was, to try to look for, and hopefully find these documents in Babylon. And again, Babylon was the hub of the empire. Right? It was the economic and administrative center. But as I mentioned as well, it was kind of hot, to the point where the entire government, the main people, they would move during the summer to another location, and there was this sort of mountainous retreat that they went to that was a lot cooler, that served as a secondary capital during the summer months. And that goes to show you one thing, at the very least. Here we have a situation where something seemed expected. Something seemed commonsensical. Something seemed very likely. What was that something? If in fact the documents were to be found, they were to be found in Babylon. That's what everybody thought. That's what the governors thought. Very likely that's what Darius thought. That's what the scribes thought, or else they wouldn't have gone there to try to find it. But after looking for, searching for these documents, after they couldn't find them, they went ahead and widened their search to other locations and eventually found them in Acmetha, which was, again, this other place that was a secondary capital of sorts. That just goes to show you that even though we have ideas, we have speculations, we have, a level of insight, we have expectations, and sometimes these expectations are somewhat of a consensus. Everybody agrees and everybody thinks, well, this is what should happen. This is where you should find something. This is what should occur. At the end, no one really knows. At the end, we are utterly and completely powerless. We can, speculate. We can use common sense, but no one really knows aside from God. God is the one that ultimately knows. He is the one that has the answers. Sometimes the expected answers, the one that we think of, they kind of line up with the true answers, which are God's answers. Other times, they don't. But ultimately, the answers are found in God. God is the one that always knows. So God is the one that knew where these documents were. And to God, it must have been comical to just kind of see, or maybe the angels, I don't know if God really cares that much, but maybe the angels were looking down from heaven and seeing the scribes look over the documents. And it must have been, tedious work, right? Just going through all of these, bureaucratic paperwork to try to find this single decree. And it was one of many. While they were there up in heaven, just kind of having, a chuckle, thinking, you'll never find it there. It's nowhere near there. You're going to have to go to a completely different place. It's in another location, and it's safe because God is the one that was keeping that in that other location. But again, they had to try and figure that out until they went to the right location. But also, this portion of the story is rather odd, because it seems like there was a level of interest that doesn't make sense. Think about this for a second. You have the Jews who are, nobodies. They don't have any power. They don't have much influence. They are one of many conquered people within this umbrella of the Medo-Persian Empire. But then there is a request made to investigate in their favor. And again, they are just one of many conquered people. And even though it was an official request, you could think that the higher ups, once they received this request, they would have said, okay, we'll investigate, and then they might have delayed, sort of like, I don't know, if you've ever had to deal with the DMV or AT&T or any other entity that, is bureaucratic in nature. You make a request, and they'll get to it. Eventually, they'll get in line. Get in line, and then once you get to the front of the line, it turns out that you need another form, and then you have to go to the back of the line and wait again and wash and repeat. And then once it's done, it's really not done because the person who needs to make that decision is on vacation and will only come 3 weeks thereafter. But even after 3 weeks, you have to make an appointment, but you cannot make an appointment right now. You can only make an appointment when they come back. And then when you do make an appointment, the phone system doesn't really work, so then you have to, you know how it goes, right? Why? Because there is no incentive for them. It is your problem. It's not their problem. Now, they are there to kind of solve problems, but at the end of the day, it's not going to affect them. So there's no rush. There is no enticement to be very diligent, to work very hard, to expedite the process, to be very efficient. So here we have a situation which is odd, because an official request was made, and they were extremely diligent. They were working very hard for something that was not specially favorable for them. Who cares if the Jews get their way? But again, they went to the initial place, which was the most likely location. After searching, they couldn't find it. Did they stop? They could have stopped. They even should have stopped and said, hey, we can't find it, tough break. Stop rebuilding. No, they continued their search. They went 300 miles northeast to another location, and likely if they didn't find it there, they would have gone to somewhere else. Why? Why was there this level of diligence in the favor of the Jews? It doesn't make sense on the surface, but actually, from a historical political sense, it made perfect sense. Why? So again, Cyrus was this emperor, this original emperor, that allowed the Jews to go back to their homeland. After he died, a couple other people rose to power, but they weren't very significant. They didn't last very long. And then now we have Darius. But Darius was a distant third cousin of Cyrus. So and this is more or less in the initial phase of his reign. And there were still questions regarding his claim to the throne. So Darius, just from a purely political perspective, he had to make sure that people accepted him, that people vouched for him, that people, again, agreed with his claim to the throne. So what he did was he positioned himself as a champion of Cyrus's legacy. Essentially what he was doing was, look, I am the new king, and the way that I'm going to legitimize this position, which certain people are questioning, it's for me to get closer to Cyrus. How am I going to do this? I'm going to be a champion of his legacy. I'm going to make sure that everyone remembers all the things that he has done. And I'm going to fight to make sure that the history that we have is going to be favorable to whatever it is that he did. And by doing this, then people are going to acknowledge, people are going to accept my position as king. So what he was doing here was rather self-centered in a way. He might have wanted to help the Jews a little bit, but first and foremost, he wanted to help himself. And by investigating and eventually finding the decree, what essentially he was doing was saying, look, I found the decree from Cyrus, and now I'm lining up my decree with his decree, so you know that we are working hand in hand, essentially. And now I am sort of this figure that is close to Cyrus historically, where you can see this flow of authority coming from him to me, and, you know, vice versa. So we see the hand of God in this as well. All of this was happening while no one was aware, in the background. And even to a degree, it started happening many years prior to this incident. Everything was falling into place, and it had to fall into place in a very precise manner. Think about this for a second. This document had to be preserved. This king had to have interest in trying to find it. People needed to investigate so that would have occurred to begin with. Now, you can be very matter of fact about all of these occurrences and just say that it was all happening by chance, right? Luck. Or, evidently, and even if you're open, beyond a shadow of a doubt, God was working. He was working in the background. He was giving answers to questions that people hadn't even asked yet. He was placing people in strategic locations and roles and categories and levels of authority, to the point where, again, as history was unfolding, God's will was being revealed. And regardless of the thoughts and the ideas and the anxieties, right? There was a level of anxieties from the Jews' perspective that was probably pretty high up there. But even before anything was happening, God already had the answer, the favorable answer. What does that say about when we get anxious? You know how it goes. You lose sleep. Your mind, your brain, it seems like it never turns off. You think about something, and you rethink about something, and you rethink about something. You come up with potential answers to the problem and maybe secondary solutions, tertiary ways of solving that problem. And all of that is happening. And you're just, again, borderline driving yourself crazy, where all along, God has already been at work. Even before the problem, God was already putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And then as history unfolds, we see how they come together. And in hindsight, after the fact, what do we usually do or say? It wasn't that bad, right? Why was I so worried? Why did I lose so much sleep? Why was I so anxious? But that's after the fact. So let us learn these lessons, not only from personal experiences, but also from these stories that the Bible depicts. God is in control. He has the answers to the questions before they are even raised. The solutions to the problems before they are even being experienced. Amen.